Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started, as long as they're ready over there. My name is Deanna Heikkinen. I'm a longtime educator, former college professor who walked away from the corrupt system about 8 years ago. And since then, I've been a homeschool advocate, and went from one pendulum swing to the other, where I was, personally, publicly educated all the way through up until I got my doctorate in education. And then my early experiences with homeschooling were not good, my first kind of interaction with it as an adult. And so once I walked away from the system, I became a very staunch homeschool advocate, like pretty aggressive for me, which is probably still passive for a lot. And lately, I've done a lot of self-reflection about education, and I've kind of come back from that. And so I'm going to talk about that experience and that process. And I coined a term called own schooling, and I wrote a book. It actually is published this week. I'm going to have it at Learning Bitcoin, so I'm kind of launching it this week. But really, it's about empowering families to take charge of their kids' education, no matter how they're educating. And why I took a step back is that I work with families. I have people contacting me on Twitter. I have people contacting me asking about homeschooling, what they can do with their kids, how they can help educate their own children. And places like Germany, homeschooling is illegal. You'll have your kids taken away from you. And so I kind of had to take a step back and figure out a way to support families and help families that couldn't necessarily homeschool. Plus, because of dirty fiat, as been mentioned before, most families nowadays, at least in the West, have to have two incomes. Both parents have to work. So what does that mean? That means that what are you going to do with your kids all day? That's what I get the question. I'm working, what are my kids going to do? Well, when the kids are older, it's a little easier. But when you have, little kids, someone has to watch them. So now you're working, one parent is working to pay childcare, and that's a problem. So I really, for the last 6 months, have been thinking deeply about this and how I can help support families who have kids, or people who, maybe they don't have kids, but they have nieces and nephews, friends, and they're, as a Bitcoiner, you kind of get asked a lot about sovereignty and freedom in a lot of areas, not just in money. And so one way to support the families is to say, okay, if you have to send your kid to school, whether it's public or private, you can still teach them to be curious. You can still kind of back this up, even if you can't homeschool the traditional way or unschool, which is, there's different approaches to homeschooling. There's about 8 different kind of structured approaches, even though unschooling is unstructured, but it's still a thing. You can still do that, even if they're sent to school. So I wrote this book, and I've spent quite a bit of time figuring out how how you can support these kids who are in schools. And sometimes they're being taught things that you don't want them to teach, you don't want them to learn. So part of it is deprogramming, and that's really important as well. So another thing that I reflected as I was writing Own Schooling, which the full title is Own Schooling, Bitcoin Sovereignty and Education, is how money and having an understanding of money from the parents' perspective, but also the children's perspective, is incredibly important. The first chapter is all about my own story, and I did not grow up with a healthy relationship with money. And so now, in addition to helping families with the education piece, there has to be education with economics, because what they're going to learn in school, if they learn anything, is dirty fiat. So we don't, you have to, once again, deprogram them for that. And so with knowledge of Bitcoin, you can provide your family with stability. You can think about the future in different terms, that low time preference. And so fundamentally, it changes everything about the entire family with this sort of economic piece in place. With this economic piece in place, if you're a Bitcoiner, you're thinking of the future. Your money's going to go up if you're saving in Bitcoin. And so then you can have time and energy, proof of work, to help your family's minds or your children's minds. And that's the ultimate thing, is that you don't want to outsource your money. So you don't want to outsource your children's minds. I almost think that the children's minds are more important than money, because that's the future, right? If we don't educate the kids properly, if we just let them be taught in this Prussian system that was all about indoctrination. It was all about this militaristic factory workers. That's what our education is based on in the modern world. If that's all we leave them and we don't, as a parent or educator or aunt, uncle, grandparent, whatever, if we don't step in and make a difference, then it's, we can be Bitcoiners to the end of the world, but we're not going to have curious, critical thinking populace. And that's what we need. So think about it. A few years ago, lockdowns, how easy was it to get everybody to just stay in home? How easy was it to have 4 or 5-year-olds in Zoom classes, which I kind of, as an educator, is pretty abusive. How horrible was it to have 4 and 5-year-olds in classes with masks on behind a screen? And it was enforced. So it was easy to control. So if you're a Bitcoiner, once you have the education piece down, then you can have this more curious family. You can have kids that are going to think for themselves. And so homeschooling is a parent-led, agency-first way of educating your family. Whether you send them to school or not, you have to be involved. And I'm going to date myself here, but growing up in the 70s, my mom was always very invested. We moved probably 16 times during all the way through high school. I'm from the States, so I don't know how that translates to other countries. But so every time she moved, she would investigate the school system. She would look at our teachers. She requested teachers. She moved us from classes. She was involved. So I call her the first own schooler, because even though my sister and I were publicly educated, she was invested. She wrote the letters. She went to talk to the teachers. She said, no, you're not going to teach them that. And that's what you have to do. So as I'm a homeschool teacher. I'm actually an independent teacher now. I teach reading and writing and history. And so one thing that I've done is that I've had families take their kid out of the history class in 5th grade because they didn't like what they were teaching. And then they had me teach the 5th grade, just Western Civ, normal, kind of from a critical point of view, looking at different viewpoints, but it wasn't indoctrinating. I'm from the States, and so when they would bring in different curriculum, the BLM week or whatever, they would pull their kids out, and I would just, give them an alternate. So there are things you can do as an own schooler that you can help control what your, control's the wrong word. You can help inspire what your kids are learning, and it can align with your values. And there's a big debate going on in the States right now about, is it more do parents actually have the intellectual rights of their children? For me, that's horrendous. You should have the intellectual rights for your children. But there's, debates between school boards and parents and what they can learn and all of this stuff. So it's a big deal. And so more now than ever, you need to be involved. And so agency is about taking responsibility. The proof of work really is Bitcoiners, is what agency is. You can increase the curiosity for your kids. Keep them asking questions. Curiosity, even what Seb was saying, that's our path forward. As long as we're curious, then there's a hope for the future. One thing about public school and a lot of standardized education now, it kills curiosity. So I teach kids from the tri-state area, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania. I have 5th graders that parents pay $60,000 a year for their education, and they still have to hire me to teach them writing because they're not learning writing in school. And the kids are totally just lack curiosity. They don't want to learn. They're bored. They're not challenged. And it's a problem. So this is another thing you can do. If your kid, if you live in a place where you have to have your kids at school for whatever reason, you can offer supplemental curriculum. There's so much out there. And you can do offline as well as online. I'm a big one of the main issues I see with kids is too much screen time, so it kills the melatonin and you kind of go down that light rabbit hole. And so I recommend a lot of offline resources for parents. Go buy hard books. In case my presentation didn't work, I'm totally old school, so I have paper here if you're curious about that. So there are things that you can do as a parent or as a family that you can encourage, have that agency, encourage independence, and encourage curiosity with your kids. So public school, private school, homeschooling, it doesn't matter. But I really encourage parents to be active, and I'll have my contact information. So if you want any resources, or if there's anything, if you're curious about how to get started homeschooling, or my kid has to go to school, so what can I do? Reach out to me and I can definitely help you with that. But you can take passive learning into active learning, even if your kids are going to school for 7 or 8 hours a day. I'm a classical educator, and so I believe definitely in the classical education model. And I'm going to talk about this, and I'm going to talk about how you can teach Bitcoin and financial literacy through Bitcoin and the history of money through this method. So in the classical approach, and this goes back to ancient Rome, there's the trivium, which is the grammar stage, the logic phase, and then the rhetoric phase. In the grammar stage, this is where they're 5 to 10 years old. You just pump them full of facts. These are, this is how you build their curiosity. Conceptually, kids' minds grow like over time. They cannot handle really big abstractions. They can't connect those dots. So you give them concretes. You just, lots of facts, lots of facts, lots of facts. And that's how the first stage that you're going to do. Then when they get to about 10 or 15, that kind of middle stage or middle school age, they start wanting to piece those concretes together. They're curious about cause and effect. Hey, this happened, why? On a pretty, small scale. And then when they're in high school, when they're a little bit older, that's when they want to argue. Does anybody know a teenager? Have you ever met a teenager? Yeah, I'm kidding. So they like to argue. And so this is the rhetoric phase. And this is kind of the natural progression of our human brain development. So this follows that. So you don't want to teach, first graders or 7 or 8-year-olds about, Bitcoin, and we need Bitcoin because of fiat. I mean, you can teach them these terms very, very, in a very kind of easy manner. I created a memory game, and it just has monetary symbols from across time. So they can recognize what it is. But you're not going to go into deep, conceptual, why this happens, why this is, until they're much older. Otherwise, it's indoctrination. And I'm an educator, not an indoctrinator, so I'm really cautious about that. So why do we want to teach kids Bitcoin? Well, we're Bitcoiners, right? It's a better form of money. But it also, it can teach them a little bit about privacy when it's age appropriate. You can teach them to be sovereign. You can teach them what it means to be free. You can teach them a little bit about control, probably in that logic phase, not in the grammar phase. And you can teach them to be active in their own lives. I think a lot of kids are passive now, and they just kind of go from one activity to the next activity to the next activity. I have high school kids that don't know their schedule because they just are passively being like, now we're going to go to soccer, now we're going to go here. And so it really teaches them to be active and engaged in their own life as well. So here are just some kind of suggestions what to do at each stage. In the grammar stage, you might want to talk to them about what money is, really basic. Maybe what Bitcoin is, it's a type of money, and it lives on in the computer, or however you want to structure that. In the logic phase, you want to teach them a little bit about how it works, and then when they're older, you want to teach them how to defend it. So it kind of goes naturally with complexity as you go through time. So in the grammar stage, there's some great books. I'm working on a whole series of books for the grammar and the logic phase, and so storytelling works really well. MPB has a little character in their book, the little Satoshi guy, so you can even show them the diploma, and they can just recognize that little guy. That's a Satoshi, and that's all they need to know. They're not going to understand it on a fundamental level. You can use games. There's so many great games out there. Some of them are more complex, so don't, it'd be like taking Stratego with a 4-year-old. You probably don't want to do that. And then you can ask them questions, and you can make up these scenarios so they can really learn. In the logic stage, you're going to encourage them to start making connections between these things. So if you're teaching them some, history of money and cowrie shells, you might want to make connections of why this went away. Why did they stop using cowrie shells? Why don't we use those anymore? And so you can start piecing things together. Again, not on the rhetoric stage where they're going to really argue it, but just conceptually where they can understand it. And that's one of my big beefs about modern education, is that they're not meeting kids where they can conceptually understand things. And then you can teach them some like P2P transactions with wallets and things like that. Simple. In the rhetoric stage, this is where it gets really fun. And so you can teach them about privacy. You can teach them to defend Bitcoin, what sovereignty is. You could teach them about proof of work. You can have them set up a node. Maybe a little bit younger, they can do some of those things depending on how computer savvy they are. And again, these are just kind of guidelines. And there's always going to be that exceptional kid that, at 8 years old could figure this out. But in general, this is the stages. And you want to foster independence and curiosity. That's the goal when you're raising. I think that should be the goal when you're raising kids, is to make sure that they can think for themselves. And they're not just parrots repeating things, which is what they're getting in school nowadays, is that first graders are taught really abstract concepts about race and gender, environment, and all they do is just repeat and parrot that information. And you want them to understand, absorb. That's why you just fill tons and tons of facts. Just give them symbols and money and a little bit of history on a simple way, and then you repeat it in the middle stage. And then you repeat it again in the rhetoric stage. And every time you repeat the same information, it's much more complex. You want kids to be okay with mistakes. You want to encourage them to make mistakes. Set up a node, it didn't work. Okay, let's figure out why. And that's going to encourage their curiosity. It's also going to make them resilient and be able to persevere through issues. And then you don't want to just raise dogmatic children. You want them to kind of understand, but also ask questions. Questioning is huge, and open-ended questions is definitely a big part of that. So for parents or teachers, or pretty much anybody who is interacting with children, use real-world examples. Again, conceptually, where it fits with them, where it aligns with them. Create learning experiences. So I know I live in El Salvador, and we have a community of Bitcoiners there. And there's been like lemonade stands. So little 6, 7-year-old girls are, selling lemonade, and they're using Lightning wallets, and they can understand, a little bit, but we're not teaching them the ins and outs, like the huge philosophical reasons why Bitcoin at that point. But they're learning that it's a form of money, and then the next day they can look at their wallet and they see it's worth more, and so they can, catch on to that. So you want to have these real-world examples. If you're with kids, if they can make something and sell it, we have the Bitcoin Farmers Market down there, and we have kids selling things. It's so cool because they get so excited. So they make these little friendship bracelets, and they sell them for a few sats, and then they see the money grow. And so it kind of teaches them that hard work, they can sell, they can earn. And there's so many lessons in that. And encourage kids to do their own research. Don't just hand them everything. Say, okay, this is a problem. Why don't you go, research it? Watch BT sessions, or, if they're setting up a node or something like that, right? You don't want to just give them everything. You want to teach them how to find the answers. Keep the discussions age appropriate. I'm so against indoctrination. That's why I walked away from the system, and why I teach outside of the system as much as possible. Have open conversations. Let your kids talk. If they say, hey, I talked to my friend and their dad said that they can't play with me anymore because of Bitcoin, then you know what? Maybe call that parent and find out what's going on. And maybe you approach the parent, maybe you can have these open conversations and talk to your kid. If they're ostracized, which is never fun, you can have those conversations of why maybe that happens. They don't understand it, so maybe they're a little afraid. So there are things that you can do. And then resources. There's so many resources for Bitcoin out there. Again, make sure it's age appropriate, but you can encourage your kids to explore those as well. So what you want to do is figure out what stage your kids are, or the kids that you're with, and start there. So if you're like, oh, okay, they're in the rhetoric stage, then you can go ahead and start at that level. But if they're still in the grammar phase, then just find ways to give them age appropriate. So you're not going to hand them, Bitcoin Standard, obviously. And you want to make sure that even if it's for kids, you read it first, because there's a lot of books that are deemed for kids, and they're still really complex. And those young kids are going to be overwhelmed, and they're not going to be able to process that information. And then try to find other families, connect with any, circular economies around the world are spread up. Find other people near you. Bitcoin meetups, there's just so much that are there. So I think there should be like Bitcoin family meetups. And so it should be for kids. You can share homeschooling or educational resources that kids can learn, maybe P2P, play with sats back and forth. And so I would love to see like family meetups in addition to our adult meetups that we have. And in El Salvador, there's usually a couple of kids, but they're pretty bored. So how cool would it be for people who have kids to start, Bitcoin family meetups, and you go to the park or something like that? Another thing you can do is have Bitcoin discussions as a family. I know a lot of families don't sit down to Sunday dinners like I did when I was growing up, but you can, say, hey, there's this new Bitcoin thing, there's a new wallet out, let's go explore it, let's learn about it together. And you can do that as a family. Even with younger kids, they can participate. And I'm, again, old school, so I like to write everything by hand, but you can also have an online notebook, maybe like a document that's offline, and you can have like the question of the week, or you can assign questions to your kids, say, okay, who's going to do the question of the week about Bitcoin this week? And you can talk about it for family, you can look it up together, and you can find those answers. And then you can track this over time and see kind of how their understanding of Bitcoin evolves over time, and that can be really useful. And then they can look back at it and see how much they've learned. I wish I would have done that on my journey. It's been a very long journey, but it would have been kind of cool to see how my conviction changed over time. So that might be fun for them. And so in terms of education, does anybody have kids? How involved are you, if you are open to talking about that? Like, do they go to school? Do you homeschool? How does that work? She's only 3. Okay. Yeah, Kate? My son homeschooled himself. Okay, so he's homeschooled. How old is he? Yep, that's a great age. Nice. So the difference between a 3-year-old and a 13-year-old is that you can't leave the 3-year-old home with YouTube, right? So that's what I'm saying. Like, find where your kids are at and meet them there. But there are ways that you can encourage learning, curiosity, understanding of Bitcoin, no matter what ages they are. And the big thing is about active learning. Don't just passively tell them everything, but ask them questions and engage them in the learning process. And then you also want to just have an environment that fosters independence. Encourage your kids to be independent. I teach classes on executive functioning for both kids and then educators. And it's shocking sometimes that, executive functioning are those little things that we just use every day, like planning, goal setting, time management. And there's such a decline in executive function nowadays, even with adults all the way down, that giving them a planner when they're like 10 or 11 years old and having them start writing in their own schedule, that's massive. Memory games when they're really little, 3-year-old memory games, help with executive functioning. So there's a lot of things that you can do to help them with independence and curiosity, even if they're going to be going to regular schooling, or what we consider regular schooling, which is actually more new compared to the history over time. Okay, any questions?
talking to some people that makes sense, but I actually think it's very upbeat. Like the topic you mentioned really briefly. What's your recommendation for parents to kind of do something before the system changes itself?
So there's two different methods. You can be ahead of the curve. So for instance, I use a lot of examples and a lot of anecdotes from families I've worked with over the years. And one of the things is to try to have that preemptive strike. So know that, does everybody know what BLM, Black Lives Matter, that movement in the States? We're just going to go through that we believe that that's indoctrinating on it for like a first, second, third grader, right? So I had a family whose second grader didn't really understand anything about race. Like they had friends from all different backgrounds. Went to school and mom said, what did you learn? She learned, and the student said that she learned that white people had to help black people because of this curriculum, right? So there are things that you can do before that. You can say, one, pull them out of school for that week if it's just that little section. Oh wow, they have the flu. Sorry, they can't show up. Can I get the homework? Talk to the teacher, which is what I would do. Talk to the teacher and say, hey, this doesn't align with our values. The teacher's probably going to freak out. That's okay. And say, can we have an alternative assignment? Go to the school. We're not going to participate in this. I need an alternative assignment. If they totally say, no, that's not okay, blah, 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 say, I'm going to pull them from that one class. They're only going to miss that one class. And you just stand your ground. You may not be popular. Teachers will talk, trust me. They're going to know, oh, you have that student, just be prepared. And it's actually a good thing because they're going to know. So you can do that. If they, like this family, didn't know that was going to happen, they had to go in and deprogram. So they had to go and talk to this little, like 7-year-old girl, 8-year-old girl, and say, some people believe that, but that's not reality. And backtrack and just say, and then there's the why, right? Just keep talking to them. I have another family whose son was in high school and had been raised to be very curious, even though he went to private school all the way through, extraordinarily curious. And by the time he got to high school, and this is in the Pacific Northwest where we are now, but in the States, it was so indoctrinating. And he would actually just be the rebel rouser in class. Like he was a really good student, A student, but he would like raise his hand and challenge the teacher and challenge the class because he was raised to be curious, raised to be an independent thinker. And that's what you have to do, is try to encourage your kids to think for themselves and have them just ask questions. You can also teach them, when they're older in that rhetoric stage, teach them to be Socrates. Just keep asking questions. If someone says this, ask a question. When I was in my doctorate of education program, I was the rebel rouser, and I'm like the, Hermione up in the front row raising my hand, perfect student growing up. And it was fun because all I did was ask questions. Raise my hand. My dissertation was on intellectual diversity, and everything was diversity except for intellectual diversity. It was all about skin color, gender, blah, blah, and so I'd raise my hand. What about intellectual diversity? Aren't we a college? Shouldn't be about learning? No, they didn't care. So I just kept raising my hand, asking questions. So I was just Socrates the whole time. And it helped. It's kind of fun. And then they dig themselves in holes and you just smirk. So that's fun. Any other questions, comments? Well, thank you so much. There's my contact information. I'll be at Learning Bitcoin, and I have a little booth if you want to chat, so you can come up and ask me about education.
Thank you very much, Deanna. That was awesome.